Thank you very much. Um, it's really a joy to be here with you all, especially because I really feel it brings my life to full circle in two ways. First, I'm an immigrant, like many of our participants, and as a child, my family and I fled to America for safety. And now as an immigration attorney for about the last 20 years, I really feel fulfilled being able to help the immigrants that are coming after me. And the second way that's really neat and how I feel I've had a chance for my life to come full circle is that, yeah, as a child, I remember being so amazed by my favorite aunt. My favorite aunt is Belgian, and she worked at the respected Belgian consulate in Los Angeles. So I am honored to be a panelist along with the Consul General of Belgium today and the rest of you. So let's get to some immigration fun. What we're going to talk about today, as you can see on this slide there, is there's been so much news about immigration and so many changes, even before COVID, let alone now during the COVID pandemic. So I'm going to give you some highlights about what are the immigration options that are still alive and well, despite the president's frightening tweet about suspending immigration. We'll talk about travel restrictions and solutions. As we know, the borders have international travel has become extremely more challenging and limited, not just from a health perspective, but trying to navigate all the different legal hurdles. We'll talk some solutions there. We'll talk about some solutions in terms of immigration applications at the US consulates, including at the US consulate in Belgium. And lastly, we'll talk about the, one of the big impacts on my corporate clients and business owners have on their minds is, well, we have these financial difficulties that Nicolai just described well and Jeff referenced. Well, there's also a repercussion on an immigration front. If you need to take action to reduce salaries or lay off employees, and if they have immigration status, you will need to keep that in mind to keep the immigration status in good shape. So I want to be able to make this talk as engaging as possible and tailor the talk to the immigration statuses that are most important to you. So let's start with a poll. And it's a little bit tricky on Zoom, but we're going to try and do this. If you can queue up the poll, Elaine, please. I'd like to know what types of immigration status are most concerning to you now. And I will weave in some of these answers as we talk. And I'm seeing this here on my screen. I will go ahead and submit and let the rest of you do the same. And perhaps as Jeff did, I will also use a hypothetical and make up some facts about Nicolai and the potential immigration stuff for him or his employees, and talk about the immigration consequences to think about and the solutions. So I'll just continue speaking, and Elaine, when the poll results are ready, you can share that with us, and here we go. Wonderful, I love this. Okay. So the green cards are one of the most concerning issues for our participants. So we'll make sure to talk about that. I'm going to make some notes for myself as we review this. Or I'll just leave this open. Perfect. And then E2, as I suspected, E2 investor visas. And then next most important is L1A transferee visas, and then also H1B specialty occupation visas. So good. We'll have a chance to discuss all this in our remaining time. So let's start with some good news, right? Everyone likes some good news. There was that crazy late night tweet that we're accustomed to now, unfortunately, where the president said we are going to suspend all legal immigration to the United States. So what really ended up becoming of this? Well, I'll tell you that the impact has been very minimal. It is when it was actually written, and probably because it had some review by some lawyers who could talk some sense and explain what is and is not legal to do, the restrictions became pretty narrow. I will say, though, that there are hints still in the executive order that there could be additional restrictions coming, and there might be some restrictions coming for persons with work visas. So that is something to be aware of, and I always write blogs on our website to continue and update the general community about these changes. But so the good news is that despite this supposed suspension, I'll just run through some of the types of immigration applications that the government is still accepting. So all the things that are still available to you all as immigration solutions. So one big category are all those applications that are filed within the United States. Those are all filed with the Department of Homeland Security, and all of those applications are still being accepted. So those are applications much like the ones that our audience referenced: L1A applications, H1B applications for people who already have an H1B visa number, E2 investor applications for those people who are already in the United States, and green cards for people who are already in the United States. I didn't include this on the poll, but some people might be interested in US citizenship or naturalizing to become a US citizen. That is also a type of application that is still being accepted here within the United States. So even though these applications are being accepted here within the United States, there are some changes and challenges you can imagine, right? Nicolay had to close down having the public come to his premises, and well, so has the US Citizenship and Immigration Services. So the US CIS offices are closed for public interfacing activities. So they are still adjudicating and processing the applications, but for some of those applications that require an interview, such as a green card application, those interviews have been put on hold. Now, interestingly, we have seen in some of our cases, the government has actually said, okay, fine, we're not interviewing you. We can see your application is strong and thorough and successful. We're just going to approve your application anyway and just forget about the interview. So that's a little bit of common sense, happy news. Otherwise, if an interview had already been scheduled, the government has automatically canceled those appointments and will automatically reschedule those appointments when the USCIS is meeting with the public again. So there isn't any, you don't need an attorney, there's nothing really you need to do. That's supposed to be on an automatic basis. Other changes that have come about with these applications in the United States is public-facing biometrics appointments and oath ceremonies, or these other things that are done in person. Similarly, those are on hold. And then the last item to be in the know about is, even though they're accepting the applications and processing them, the government has suspended what's called premium processing. Some of you may be familiar with that. You pay the government extra money, they process your application faster, and this can be important depending on the immigrant's full immigration strategy and the timeline that's necessary to get an approval to make sure either they get to work on time, have their work authorization on time, or it might be so that they don't fall out of status. Again, there are different strategies that can be taken even without premium processing to try and meet those goals, but something for you to keep in mind. So amongst this umbrella of good news, things that you can still continue doing, is consulate appointments. Even though, for the most part, the consulates appointments and routine activities for the US consulates are suspended, there is a means to get an appointment, but on an emergency basis. We'll talk about that. And lastly, green cards from outside the United States. Many of these are still proceeding forward. If the president's tweets had any kind of narrowing down on the options, this is a category that it affected the most. But even with that, there are exceptions so that spouses or children of US citizens can continue to apply for immigration benefits, as well as investors who are applying for a green card from outside the United States. Some might be familiar with the EB-5 program. So that's our good news about all the immigration solutions and options that are still available to immigrants and businesses. Now I'm going to move on to the next point on the slide, which are the COVID-19 travel restrictions and solutions. So as you might know, the US has prohibited entry from persons who have been in the Schengen area, including Belgium, during the 14-day period before their entry to the United States. Because of the high rate of COVID-19 cases in that area, the US government has found it to be wise to supposedly protect the health of the US folks to not allow people into the United States if they have been in those countries with a high rate of infection within the last 14 days. So say you are participating on the webinar from Belgium and you're wondering, well, how the heck am I going to be able to get back into the United States to continue my business in the US or attend my board meeting? I'm an executive. Well, there are exemptions to this prohibition I just mentioned. One exemption is by establishing that it's in the national interest for you to be able to come into the United States, even though you've been in the Schengen area in the previous 14 days. There is no guidance about how the government is interpreting this national interest, but I can tell you from my experience, my interpretation is, if you're a CEO who is going to be, financially saving a company and saving US jobs by being able to enter the United States, that will catch the government's attention in a good way. Or if you're affiliated with a hospital or some COVID relief operation, that was clearly be in the national interest for you to be able to come anyways. And then there's a bunch of other exemptions as well, depending on whether you have a relative who is a US citizen or green card holder. If you do meet one of these exemptions, such as a national interest or having a US relative, then you can enter the United States if you, make your case, prove your case, but there are also some very designated airports that you can fly into, and you'll be subject to some additional health screenings there. Once you get in the United States, you will have to quarantine for 14 days after arriving in the United States. So let's talk about some creative solutions. What if you are trying to enter the United States from one of these prohibited countries? You don't really have a good case for meeting the exemption. What do? Well, what we've done for some of our other clients is have them go to a safe third country and wait there for 14 days before entering the United States. So say you have someone from Belgium who needs to come into the United States. They may choose to fly into Mexico, wait there for 14 days, and then fly to the United States from Mexico. And when questioned by the officer at the US airport, they can honestly answer that, no, I have not been in the Schengen area for the last 14 days, and that will allow them to come into the United States. We've been also suggesting a similar strategy which has worked for our clients, which was going to Canada, but that option as a very dynamic situation and rules changing all the time, that is not such a great option anymore because now Canada has made it difficult for people from elsewhere to enter their country. Okay, before I move on to the next two topics, I'll just pause and see if anyone has questions about what we've talked about so far.
There are a couple questions that are related in some ways. The first question from Pete is, in the current circumstances, if a green card holder is out of the US for more than 6 months, is he still at risk of losing the green card status in the current circumstances or not?
Yes, that is a good question. So I would say that it's not a risk if they can take certain actions to minimize the risk, right? And for the participants who might not be familiar with this, we start with a general rule that the government gives you a green card so that you are maintaining your home and your life within the United States. If you are out of the United States for a long period of time and you try and use your green card to come back in, the office is going to say, wait a second, you haven't been living here. Your home and life has not been in the United States. I'm going to try and take your green card away from you through some legal mechanisms. So the way you can, so that being the worst case scenario, you can take certain actions to minimize that risk. For example, if you, for example, question came from Pierre. If, for example, you have not already left and you're wondering about if you leave the US and I can't come back, will I have problems? Well, there's a really good solution. The best and easiest is to apply for special permission, which allow you to be outside of the United States as a green card holder for an extended period of time, up to 2 years even. And when that 2 years is done, it can even be applied for again for another 2 years or up to 4 years. And we've done this, for example, for executives from France and Belgium who've worked in the United States. Now they got stationed back to the headquarters and they want to keep their green cards. This is one good mechanism for that. Well, but what if you're already outside the United States and you have your green card and you went for 3 months and you expected to come back and now no flights and restrictions and the clock is ticking. So if you can, so these are the other factors I would suggest. Keep your absence under 12 months. Document that you continue to keep your home and life in the United States. Continue to file tax returns as a US resident. And also document why you are out of the US for longer than you anticipated. If you have a canceled flight, keep documentation of that canceled flight. If the doctors prohibited you from flying or you have some health conditions, document that. What's our next question?
So the next question is relative to employment or authorization. Gus is asking that for several employees that are under that kind of status, so the process seems to be delayed, some others are unclear. Can we still employ those teachers?
Can we still employ? Did you say teachers?
Yes, that's teachers.
I see. Okay, Gus. So to summarize your question, I think you're asking that if an employee's work authorization is going to expire, has the government made any accommodations for their employment authorization to automatically extend during this COVID pandemic? And the answer, unfortunately, is no. I and other immigration advocates have been lobbying Congress and USCIS to make some of these common sense solutions, as have been made for other sectors in our economy, but that has not been the case. But Gus, you're still not out in the cold by yourself because there are some potential solutions. It's not, obviously, we don't know all the details of your circumstance, and what is holding up their work authorization. But there are some general rules that still help. For example, for some of the employment authorization categories, as long as you file for the application, if it's for an extension, you already hold that status, it's going to expire, and you have filed an application to extend that same status. As long as you have filed that application before the expiration of the current status, employment authorization automatically extends for 240 days, right? 8 months, unless it's denied before then. So this is not a new COVID extension. This is one that has always existed in the law and will be especially helpful to you in this circumstance. Other creative solutions might be to do a change of status. If they entered in one status, they're trying to change to another one, that application has not been approved. And at least you want them to be able to maintain some lawful status in the United States so it doesn't jeopardize that pending application. You may be able to apply for visitor status. Visitor status does not provide employment authorization, but it at least allows you to be maintaining your lawful status so that when that second application gets approved, it gets processed, it won't be jeopardized by having unlawful status currently during the COVID period. Okay. Ellen, shall I tell me what you'd like?
I do have another questions from Ben. He is asking that under a L1 or L2 visa, and after being to Belgium, will there be a law back in the US without first going 40 days to a country outside Schengen? I think you already answered that.
Yeah, and it's a good question. And so yes, we're both understanding the question the same way. Yes, I'm very familiar with L1A, L1B visas. If you have a valid visa and a valid passport, that's very good news. You also need your valid Form I-94 or I-129S if you used a blanket L. But then now you have the additional question, additional concern during COVID about these travel restrictions. And the answer is that if you've been in the Schengen area or one of those prohibited countries, including the UK, China, Iran, within the last 14 days, you will need to apply for an exemption. Now, it's interesting. I mean, this is where immigration really becomes fun. You mentioned L1, L1A, for example. L1A, people who hold L1A status are very likely, I would say, to have some good facts in their favor to meet one of these exemptions. They are for intranational transferees who are executives or managers. And so there could be a good argument that there is, they would meet one of those emergency exemptions to enter the United States.
I still have a couple of questions and we'll close the webinar. So the first question from Solange is, are there any exemption to those current rules for humanitarian reasons, typically funerals, sick parents, or things comparable?
Yeah, so humanitarian parole. So I'm understanding the question to be whether it's an exemption for the travel restrictions from the Schengen areas. And the answer I can tell you from speaking with my network and colleagues across the country is that very unlikely. Humanitarian parole, or as a way of allowing someone into the US for humanitarian reasons, has always been very limited, and it is even more limited now. So I can foresee some facts being very strong to apply for humanitarian parole, but for the most part, it's going to be an uphill battle.
Okay, and I do have the last question from Chutsui. She's asking about F1 visa. so if the school does not open until January 2021, or if courses are online during the fall, yeah, sorry about that. What's your question exactly? Can you reformulate your
I
question?
think I can give some information about that. So the question is about accommodations by the US government for students in F1 status, and that's a very good question. Fortunately, the government is showing flexibility to help students who are impacted by COVID-19. There's been a lot of guidance on that account. So some of the accommodations, for example, is if the F1 student is continuing to meet their F1 obligations by doing online learning, if that's what the university is offering, you would still be maintaining your status, which is good. If you have a medical reason to reduce your course load, there are some accommodations for that. And also some accommodations if you need to take a leave of absence. But if you are saying that you will just simply stop being a student until January and you were supposed to be engaging in a full-time course load, I don't think it's a free pass to not do anything for those many months.
Okay, yeah, because basically the question was, will we be able to re-enter in the US if the courses are online as a new F1 applicant, not as a student already in the US?
So there's another point here that the individual is raising, and that's wonderful because it brings us to that next point on the slide, which we didn't get to, and that is to let you know that those applications at the US consulates can still be accepted on an emergency basis. One of those emergency bases is if you are an F1 student that has not entered the United States yet, you would likely qualify for an emergency appointment. We did this just last week and got the emergency appointment and the approval, and the person is now in the United States. Yeah, and listen, it's been really wonderful speaking with you all. If I can help you with your specific circumstances, I'm happy to discuss that with you separately.
Okay, thank you very much. No other questions. So have you finished your different points?
Yes, are we on, if we have time, I can just mention a couple more points.
Quickly, because we have already
yeah, we've surpassed our time. Yeah, so I'll just make one more point about layoffs or salary reductions. Yes, that does have immigration impact. There might be some creative solutions for you. There are some grace periods for certain people. If you're the employer, many of the work visas have wage obligations, and so that you're not stuck with penalties, there are some actions that you would need to take as an employer. If you're an employee, if you're laid off or terminated, in most cases that also terminates your immigration status. So there are some actions you need to take to safeguard your immigration status for future immigration benefits.
Okay, thank you very much, Navid.